December 1941. Across the country, store windows glowed with Christmas lights. Families rushed through crowded streets, planning the holidays as if the world beyond the oceans didn't exist. America felt distant from danger, confident, calm, insulated. Inside the White House, the mood could not have been more different. Roosevelt leaned over a desk buried under intelligence reports stamped "Top Secret," each one darker than the last. Hitler's armies were tightening their grip on Europe. Japan had pushed deep into Indochina and was massing forces across the Pacific. American codebreakers warned that Tokyo was preparing for something unprecedented. Roosevelt absorbed the reports in silence. The world was inching toward a point of no return. Yet when he approached the microphone, his message to the nation was steady and reassuring. America will remain neutral. The public heard peace in those words. Roosevelt understood they were a temporary illusion. He saw the danger clearly. He sensed how unprepared the country was to face what lay ahead. But he also knew that telling the truth too soon would shatter the fragile calm he needed to keep the nation together. And that leads to the central question of this story. Why would a president who understood the threat so clearly pretend the country was neutral? To answer that, we have to return to the moment when Americans swore they would never again fight in a foreign war. 20 years earlier, Americans marched into the First World War believing it would end all wars. The cost was catastrophic: more than 100,000 dead, many more wounded, and an economy that slid into turmoil soon after the fighting ended. When the dust settled, Europe remained unstable, alliances fractured, and dictators began to emerge from the wreckage. The result at home was a deep, nationwide fatigue. Isolationism didn't come from politics, it came from trauma. Entire towns had lost sons. Veterans returned disillusioned. Parents who had buried children in 1918 refused to imagine sending another generation across the ocean. By the late 1930s, that sentiment hardened into a single, unshakable belief: America must stay out of Europe's problems. In 1940, a Gallup poll revealed a number few democratic societies ever see. More than 90% of Americans rejected the idea of sending troops abroad. Churches preached non-intervention. Newspapers pushed the idea that foreign wars were traps. The America First movement filled stadiums with cheering crowds. Roosevelt understood the mood intimately. Warning the nation too early about Hitler's ambitions would have been political suicide. The public wasn't ready. The country felt safe behind its oceans, and any hint of future involvement in Europe would have turned millions of Americans against him. But public resistance was only one wall closing in around the president. Another barrier, far more rigid, stood in Washington itself. Throughout the mid-1930s, Congress responded to the memory of World War I with a series of laws called the Neutrality Acts. These acts were designed to seal the country off from foreign conflict, but in practice they stripped the president of almost every tool he might use to influence events overseas. The restrictions were sweeping. The government could not sell weapons to nations at war, no matter who was the aggressor. American ships were barred from entering war zones, even if those waters carried goods vital to friendly nations. Credit and loans, lifelines for countries resisting invasion, were outlawed, and the presidency lost much of its ability to assist any nation under attack, even in situations where American interests were clearly threatened. To Roosevelt, the Neutrality Acts felt like iron shackles. He watched Hitler dismantle Europe piece by piece while the law demanded that the United States treat both the victims and the invaders exactly the same. It didn't matter who crossed whose border or who bombed whose cities, the United States was required to stand aside. He held the responsibilities of the presidency, but not the freedom to act. And even if he had that freedom, there was another harsh truth waiting beneath the surface. America, in the late 1930s, had no ability to fight a modern war. When Roosevelt looked at Europe collapsing in 1939 and 1940, he wasn't imagining danger, he was facing cold numbers. And the numbers were damning. The United States Army, on paper the guardian of a continental nation, was smaller than the forces of Portugal, Hungary, and Romania. Some units trained with broomsticks because rifles were in short supply. Others practiced maneuvers using trucks borrowed from local businesses. Entire squadrons of the Army Air Corps flew aircraft designed in the early 1930s, machines that had no chance against the Messerschmitts or Zeros, dominating the skies abroad. War planners warned Roosevelt that if the country were attacked in 1940, it could field no more than 5 combat-ready divisions, and even those were under strength. Ammunition reserves were low, radio equipment was outdated. Anti-aircraft defenses barely existed. Mobilization plans were years out of date. And industry, the miracle that would later drown the Axis in steel, was still producing refrigerators, radios, and shiny chrome automobiles. Roosevelt once asked his generals a simple question. If Britain falls, how long before America can defend itself? The answer chilled him. Not soon enough. America was a nation with enormous potential but almost no readiness. A sleeping giant, but at that moment still asleep. Roosevelt couldn't admit this publicly. If he told Americans their military was weak, he risked panic. If he acknowledged the danger too loudly, he might provoke the very attack he hoped to avoid. So neutrality became more than a political position. It became a shield, an attempt to buy enough time to transform a fragile army into a modern force. Behind the speeches, he began that transformation in secret. On the surface, Roosevelt continued to speak about peace. He talked about staying out of Europe's quarrels, about avoiding the mistakes of 1917, about letting diplomacy take the lead. Underneath that calm public posture, the country was changing at a pace unseen in American history. Roosevelt pushed through the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, a move so controversial it passed the House by a single vote. Training camps expanded across the South and Midwest, highways filled with convoys of young draftees heading toward bases that hadn't even been built a year earlier. Civilian factories slowly shifted toward defense production, accepting government contracts to build aircraft engines, armored vehicles, artillery, radios, and bombs. Shipyards along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts roared back to life. Workers who once built yachts now hammered steel plates into the hulls of destroyers. Designers worked around the clock on new fighters and bombers. Thousands of women joined the labor force early, long before Rosie the Riveter became a symbol, because defense factories needed hands, any hands, to keep up with Roosevelt's growing list of production demands. All of this happened under the banner of neutrality. Roosevelt didn't announce a march toward war. He didn't talk about fighting Hitler. He let most Americans believe the country was simply modernizing, simply preparing for possibilities. But these steps were not small. They were the foundation of a global military machine. Roosevelt gained the time he needed, but the danger continued to grow. If Britain collapsed, America would face the Axis alone. He needed a way to help the last democracy still resisting Hitler without declaring war, and he found it. By late 1940, Britain's situation was desperate. The Luftwaffe had pounded its cities for months. Merchant ships carrying food and ammunition were being torn apart in the North Atlantic by U-boats. British factories were stretched to their limits. Without help, the island that had once ruled a quarter of the world stood on the edge of collapse. Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, Hitler would control the greatest industrial region on Earth. And isolating America from that kind of power would be impossible. But the Neutrality Acts blocked him from selling weapons, or even giving them away. Instead of fighting the law, Roosevelt outmaneuvered it. In December 1940, he went on national radio and delivered a simple analogy. If a neighbor's house was on fire, he said, you wouldn't argue about who owned the hose. You'd lend it to them, and worry about the paperwork later. That metaphor became the legal basis for one of the most consequential decisions in American history, Lend-Lease. Under this program, the United States could supply any nation vital to the defense of America. The wording was vague, because Roosevelt wanted it vague. That vagueness allowed him to send Britain rifles, trucks, artillery, engines, food, destroyers, and soon enormous numbers of aircraft. Factories in Detroit and Buffalo began producing weapons not for American units, but for British pilots and soldiers. Ships left New York Harbor loaded with jeeps and aircraft engines, bound for Glasgow and Liverpool. Crates marked Made in USA were rushed to Cairo, Singapore, and Rangoon. Even the Soviet Union, after it was invaded by Hitler, began receiving American weapons through this same law. The United States still avoided the word war, but the truth was unmistakable. America had become the lifeline of the Allied world, and every new shipment made that role more visible. Hitler saw it, Churchill welcomed it, and Roosevelt quietly accepted that every shipment pushed the country closer to confrontation. Lend-Lease changed the balance of the war, but the machinery behind it also pulled the United States into territory the Neutrality Acts had never anticipated. Each shipment crossing the Atlantic required new levels of protection. Each transport exposed American ships to U-boats hunting along the ocean's trade lanes. And every decision to keep those supply routes open pushed Roosevelt into actions that looked less and less like neutrality and more like quiet confrontation. As the flow of weapons increased, The conflict that Washington tried to avoid began to move closer to American shores. As German forces pushed across Europe, Roosevelt confronted a reality that most Americans never considered. Strict neutrality worked in favor of the aggressors. He had seized Europe's factories, its mines, its oil reserves, and its rail networks. Meanwhile, every nation resisting him was cut off from American support because of the very laws meant to keep the United States safe. Diplomats inside the State Department warned that neutrality, if followed literally, would create a world where the only nations capable of exerting force were the dictatorships. Democracies, bound by rules and legal restraints, would face a rising tide with empty hands. Roosevelt saw this happening in real time. When Germany invaded Poland, neutrality demanded that the United States treat both countries the same. When German bombers leveled Rotterdam, neutrality offered no distinction between victim and aggressor. When Hitler pressed deeper into France, the White House could send sympathy, but not steel. Behind closed doors, Roosevelt told his advisers that a public declaration of war would be reckless at this stage. It would unite the German public behind Hitler, turning him from a radical gambler into a wartime leader with all the political advantages that title carried in Europe. Japan would seize the moment as well, framing the conflict as a battle for Asian survival against Western interference. The dictators were waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to rally their people. If the United States gave them one, the consequences would echo across the globe. For Roosevelt, avoiding that trap meant navigating a narrow path. He couldn't fight openly, and he couldn't stay idle. He needed actions that pressured the Axis without revealing themselves as steps toward war. And, as Europe burned, the conflict began to shift toward waters where American ships sailed and American interests lived or died. Once American supplies began crossing the Atlantic under Lend-Lease, the war moved closer to the US than ever before. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes from Greenland to the Caribbean, sinking merchant vessels faster than Britain could build replacements. British escorts were stretched too thin, their navy battered by years of non-stop fighting. To keep the flow of aid alive, Roosevelt quietly expanded the Navy's patrol zones. American destroyers began sweeping the North Atlantic, charting submarine positions, sharing intelligence with Britain, and sometimes escorting convoys under the vague label of maritime security. Officially, these missions were defensive. Practically, they placed American ships in the middle of a shooting war long before Congress approved anything of the sort. The first test came in the fall of 1941, when the USS Greer tracked a German submarine for hours and relayed its location to British forces. The U-boat fired a torpedo, missing its mark, but the exchange gave Roosevelt what he needed. He addressed the nation on radio with a calm voice that barely concealed the tension building beneath Washington's surface, and he issued a new directive. Any Axis vessel threatening American waters or American interests would be met with force. From that moment on, American destroyers followed German submarines more aggressively. The USS Kearney was struck by a torpedo near Iceland, killing 11 sailors. Weeks later, the USS Reuben James was blown apart while shielding a convoy. Over 100 American lives were lost before the United States was officially at war. None of these events triggered a declaration of war. They unfolded in a gray zone created by Roosevelt's balancing act, too aggressive to be true neutrality, yet still not a formal entry into the conflict. This quiet clash at sea deepened the crisis and strained the illusion that America stood apart from the world's turmoil. At the same time, the Pacific situation was sharpening into a confrontation far more dangerous than anything in the Atlantic. While Roosevelt navigated the Atlantic with cautious steps, the Pacific grew increasingly volatile. Japan had been fighting in China for years, and its war machine consumed vast amounts of oil. Nearly 9 out of every 10 barrels that fueled Japanese ships, planes, and industry came from American suppliers. As long as that flow continued, Tokyo could sustain its expansion. If it stopped, Japan's empire would begin to suffocate. Roosevelt understood the leverage this created, but he moved carefully. Cutting off oil outright could trigger a desperate strike. Allowing it to continue indefinitely would strengthen a regime already bent on conquest. Japanese diplomats assured Washington that their ambitions were limited, that negotiations were possible, that a stable Pacific order could be achieved. But behind their words, Tokyo pushed troops deeper into Indochina and tightened its grip on Southeast Asia. By the summer of 1941, Roosevelt judged that diplomacy alone was no longer enough. Instead of an immediate embargo, he took a step that appeared administrative on the surface, freezing Japanese assets in the United States. The freeze forced Japan to seek special licenses for every gallon of fuel. Licenses were issued slowly, then more slowly, until they stopped altogether. Without a single dramatic announcement, the oil supply that powered the Japanese empire dwindled toward zero. Inside Tokyo, military leaders knew exactly what this meant. Their remaining fuel reserves could sustain operations for little more than a year. Unless new oil fields were captured, quickly, the empire would grind to a halt. Japan now faced a tight timeline. It could negotiate, retreat, or lash out before its strength evaporated. Roosevelt hadn't declared war, but his decisions had created a strategic vice, and as tension tightened across the Pacific, the illusion of American neutrality thinned with it, setting the stage for a collision no one could avoid. As the summer of 1941 gave way to fall, Washington felt the pressure of events gathering speed. In the Pacific, American codebreakers intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages encrypted with a system known as Purple. The decrypts didn't offer a single dramatic revelation, but taken together, they sketched a clear direction. Japanese negotiators were being instructed to stall. Their offers were vague, their concessions conditional, and their deadlines abrupt. The tone shifting through those messages suggested that Tokyo was preparing for a rupture, not a settlement. Inside the State Department, analysts compared diplomatic cables to troop movements reported across Asia. Each update pointed the same way. Japan was positioning itself for a major operation. The military buildup in Indochina accelerated. Shipping lanes along the South China Sea grew congested with transports. Fuel storage tanks near Formosa were filled to capacity. Roosevelt followed every development with increasing concern. He pushed for further negotiations, not because he expected them to succeed, but because every day of delay brought the United States one more day of preparation. American factories were finally moving into high gear. New fighters and bombers were leaving their assembly lines in greater numbers. Shipyards were launching vessels at a pace that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. But the transformation was still incomplete. If war came too soon, the United States would enter the conflict, while its rearmament remained unfinished. In late November, a Japanese fleet slipped out of port and vanished into the open Pacific. American intelligence did not know the fleet's target. Some suspected the Philippines. Others believed it was heading south toward British and Dutch colonies. A smaller number worried about Hawaii. But the idea felt extreme. An attack on Pearl Harbor required a level of audacity few thought Japan capable of. During those final days, Roosevelt continued to speak of peace while preparing for the opposite. The country remained officially neutral, yet the atmosphere in the White House carried a tension that lingered in every corridor. The sense that something irreversible was approaching hung over Washington like a gathering storm. On the morning of December 7th, the storm finally reached the shores of the United States. When the news from Hawaii reached the White House, Roosevelt understood instantly that the long balancing act had come to an end. The attack on Pearl Harbor pushed the United States into the war Roosevelt had been preparing for, carefully, quietly, and under the constant pressure of laws, politics, and a reluctant nation. Looking back across the years leading to that moment, the idea of American neutrality becomes almost impossible to separate from the conditions that shaped it. Roosevelt had watched Europe collapse while being legally forbidden from intervening. He faced a public that would not tolerate another foreign war, a Congress determined to restrict presidential power, and a military far too small to stand against the dictators rising overseas. Neutrality, in public form, let the country breathe without panic while factories retooled and training camps filled. Beneath that calm exterior, the United States steered closer to confrontation every month. Roosevelt's declarations of neutrality weren't expressions of indifference or denial. They were part of a strategy born from necessity, a way to navigate a dangerous world without provoking the Axis into a premature clash, and without frightening the American public before the country could defend itself. The president lived in two realities at once, one where he reassured the nation that peace was possible, and another where he prepared for a conflict he increasingly believed could not be avoided. By the time Pearl Harbor erupted in fire, America was no longer the under-equipped nation it had been in 1939. It still faced shortages and challenges, but it now had shipyards humming, factories awake, and a military that was finally emerging from its decades of neglect. The illusion of neutrality had shielded that transformation long enough for it to take root. Through those years, Roosevelt wasn't pretending to avoid war. He was trying to survive the narrow path between readiness and disaster, waiting for the moment when the nation behind him could face a world already at war. When the last flames died on the battleships of Pearl Harbor, the United States awakened to a new identity. The shock that rolled across the country erased the divisions that had defined the pre-war years. Millions of Americans who once opposed involvement now lined up outside recruiting stations. The factories that Roosevelt had quietly nurtured surged into overdrive. Machines that had only recently produced household goods were suddenly turning out tanks, bombers, engines, and ammunition on a scale unmatched anywhere in the world. The transformation did not happen overnight, but the foundations had already been laid. The selective service system could expand smoothly because it had existed before the crisis. New aircraft designs could be manufactured quickly because engineers had been funded long before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. Shipyards possessed the steel, tools, and trained labor because Roosevelt had insisted they prepare for a future that many Americans refused to acknowledge. As the war unfolded, the United States became the industrial heart of the Allied effort. Convoys leaving American ports carried the supplies that kept Britain alive, the vehicles that powered the Soviet counteroffensive, and the aircraft that filled the skies from North Africa to the Pacific. The country that once proclaimed it would avoid foreign conflict became the central force holding the Allied world together. The story of America's neutrality before Pearl Harbor is not a story of hesitation. It's the story of a nation caught between the trauma of its past and the danger of its future, led by a president who understood that appearing calm was the only way to buy time in a world accelerating toward catastrophe. Neutrality was the surface, preparation was the substance, and when the moment came, the United States stepped into the war with the momentum of a country that had been gathering strength long before the first bombs fell on Hawaii.
A state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.